You might be able to afford my rate. I don't know if you can afford her rate.
Yes.
Let's get the semantics straight.
Yes, okay.
There's a little less uncomfortable than trying to get under a scene.
Thanks for the somewhat threatening email.
Which one?
The one you sent out said, you really ought to come, you came last year.
Well, it's just a reminder, encouragement. It's an encouragement.
Well,
Call
I
it that.
took upon it, I said, yeah, he's right.
Yeah.
It sounds like it's for slow learners, Bob.
Well, that's the way it was.
Hey, as long as learning occurs, right?
Right.
Yeah.
At some point. At some point. All right. Yeah, I kind of upgraded this time because I even have slides. It's going to be exciting. Yeah, really exciting. It's very fun. All right. I think let's get going. Let me pray and we'll get going on Daniel. Heavenly Father, thank you for this evening and thank you for the opportunity to start the study of the book of Daniel. Be with us in our conversation this evening as we just go through this book, begins going through this book and go through the introduction and just have a good discussion that is glorifying and honoring to you and help us to connect what we learned tonight with how we are to live every day. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So we're gonna tonight is mainly going to be a focus on an overview of the book of Daniel, and we'll begin actually going through the chapters next week. But I thought it'd be good to go through a quick overview to kind of give us an idea of who Daniel was, or who. There's many opinions of who Daniel was. There's also about how it was written, who it was written by, the book, the time period it was written, and why it is applicable to us today. It's one of these books that I found to be it's a book of hope. It's a book of plan, God's divine plan for good. It's a book that is, in my opinion, what I found from it as I've been reading through it and continue to study through it is it's a book of hope that was not only written for the people 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. It's a book of hope for us today because there's a lot of similar situations that we deal with that they were dealing with when it comes to just pluralistic viewpoints, idolatry, not necessarily oppression in our area, but other parts of the world there's a significant amount of oppression when it comes to Christians. So there's a lot of different viewpoints that I'll be looking at. So I think there's a lot of challenges that we can look at as well as we go through it. Before we get started, I'm going to go through the timeline next, but before I do that, I kind of wanted to get an idea from you guys. When you think of the book of Daniel, what typically comes to mind? You can't answer, Rachel, because you watched the movie, but everyone else?
Prophecy.
It's promising?
Prophecy.
Prophecy, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, a book of prophecy.
Yeah.
There's a significant amount of that. Yeah. Okay.
The Lion's Den.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, after
Yeah. Yeah. We'll talk about the historical value of the Lion's Den.
The appearance of
There's
Christ
some-
before his incarnate fleshly appearance.
Okay. Yep. We'll cover that because there's some different viewpoints on that. I think that's going to be a good one that we'll be looking over.
I thought he was a pretty bold guy that told King face to face exactly what he told him.
He'd have to be, right?
It could
Yeah.
be done in a few seconds.
Oh, immediately, right? I mean, he had witnessed that when he was thrown in the lion's den, right? I mean, in many other ways. Yeah, to be so bold to be able to go to the king who just took over your people and tell them that you're pretty much going to be out of power soon and all these other countries are going to come and take you out, that takes a lot of courage to do that.
Is there a title for that kind of guy, like a interpreter or something?
Some people refer to him as that, a seer or an interpreter of dreams.
Yeah. I just wondered,
Prophet.
Did they
Yeah.
have them on staff?
They did.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll talk. There's actually references to there were multiple seers and prophets during this time. Jeremiah was a prophet during this time as well. Ezekiel was. There's several others, all during this time period that we'll reference a few times as we go through here. But yeah, so yeah, it's a book of prophecy. It's also a book of. Some people would take it as far as the end times of the apocryphal side of the book, but there's that sort of element in that as well. It's a book of poetry. We'll cover that a little bit more. There's a lot of poetry that goes into this, and we'll point that out. Any other thoughts before we get into the timeline?
What about being a vegan?
You think he was a vegan or a vegetarian, or is there a difference?
I thought you said a deacon.
No.
Or a beacon.
A vegan? A beacon. Oh, yeah, I mean,
He wasn't eating meat or eating vegetables.
right. So he could have been a vegan.
But yes, what it's about, that's another one.
Wasn't, can you argue that being a vegan is, was what the original intent was, if you look at Genesis 1 and 2?
As I look at what?
There's
If you look at-
discussion as to when that changed.
Right. So was it
After
with,
the ark or-
was it, yeah, before or after the ark? Yeah.
Well, I guess
Yeah.
it's early Genesis. I mean, people were just eating plants. That was it.
Right.
Then when Noah, I guess after the flood, that's when we started eating meat.
Right. So, yeah.
All
so,
I'm saying is Daniel, he wasn't satisfied with the king's diet, you know.
Right, exactly. Yeah, because of the laws, but also,
No meat, no wine, just water and vegetables.
But there wasn't kosher food available to him as far as the meats.
True,
So,
yeah.
It might have been why he just ate the vegetables, because
Yeah.
he
That's-
had any available kosher meats.
it's kind of been my
He
understanding.
was the kosher meat for the lion.
Yeah, yeah. But, oh well. So, let's,
Are we carrying this too far?
no, not yet. Not yet. Not
I
yet.
think you brought it up.
But before we get any further, let's look at the timeline. So this is the timeline of the exile, in which they were, the Babylonians came and took out Judah. It's what you'll see here is that entire time period. And I think sometimes we forget it. This through the 6th century here, Daniel was part of all of this at some level throughout those time periods. So what we know is that Jehoiakim, when he was the king of Judah, he was king for about 11 years, and then he was removed by the Pharaoh Necho of Egypt. And we'll learn a whole lot more about Jehoiakim here in a little bit. Jeremiah, we know, prophesies the 70-year captivity. So if you ever wanted to go back and look at that, that's in Jeremiah 25, 1 through 11. And what he did is he pretty much said Nebuchadnezzar, or some variation of Nebuchadnezzar, was going to come and take away all of Judah because they were worshiping idols and they turned away from God. And so he had given that. There's 3 deportations of Jews, of the Jewish people. The first there is in 605, while Jehoiakim is still the king. He was with the first groups that were deported to Babylon. This group also included Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were all in the first deportation. And this took mainly, that deportation took mainly a lot of the rulers, a lot of the more educated people, kind of the ruling class is what they refer to them as, is a lot of who was taken there. And then we have in 604, we have where Nebuchadnezzar has his dream, and Daniel comes in and helps him interprets this and provides him with the idea of the successive empires that will soon eventually rule over Babylon. Jehoiakim becomes king in 598. This is after Jehoiakim is the son of Jehoiakim, just because those are fun to say. And he becomes king after Jehoiakim dies during the siege of Judah by the Babylonians. And so before he's deported and taken away, he dies, and his son takes over, who's just as evil as Jehoiakim is. And then right after that, you have that second, in 597, you have that second group of Jews who are deported, and then you probably have about 10,000 Jewish people who are deported at that point to all different parts of Babylon. I'm going to switch here real quick just so you get an idea about how far they were moving along, and they'll come back. This is a map of what you see there is the Babylonian, and the green is the Babylonian Empire during this time. And you can see here at the bottom part of that red line is Judah, and where they traveled all the way to Babylon, or the cities around Babylon. You see, so it was a significant amount of movement. It wasn't like they were going down the street. They were going a significant distance during their exile. So I thought that was just kind of a powerful viewpoint about how far these guys were sent once they were sent away and deported from their land. So as you can imagine, later on when they head back, it's quite a travel and quite a trip back to them. So how many of you were familiar with that kind of that route? I know a lot of you guys do study the Old Testament pretty closely, but
It was in the Gospel Project. We were studying just, I don't know, 4 weeks ago, I guess.
yeah, there are some references to that. To go to that. Let's see. In 586, I skipped too far down. 593, Ezekiel received his vision, and he was deported in 597, along with many others. And so Ezekiel was a contemporary with Daniel, along with Jeremiah. In 586, Jerusalem finally falls. They had been a vassal of Babylon since about 605. The Babylonians were upset with the king at the time, and because he had started to rebel against the Babylonians and what he was doing, the king was going to the Egyptians and hoping to get favor from the Egyptians in order to fight off the Babylonians. Instead of what happens is the Babylonians stop fighting the people in Jerusalem. They go to Egypt, they destroy Egypt, come back and turn Jerusalem into a heap of ruins, and for the most part is not repaired until Nehemiah returns several years later. So this falling of Jerusalem happens in 586, and then the final group of Jewish folks are deported there in 586. There's a lot of stuff that happens in the next 30 years, but and we'll cover some of those, but some of the more of the highlights that you see here is that we have another vision from Daniel there in 553, where he gets the vision of the 4 beasts. That if you guys were in Sunday school a couple weeks ago, we heard that lesson there in Daniel 7. We'll probably go a little bit deeper than Sunday school did, but we'll talk about some of the symbolism behind that. He realizes there in 539 that Jeremiah's prophecy of the 70-year exile will soon end, so he begins praying there. We'll see that, and he prays for that to end soon. 538, Cyrus of the Persians and also of the Medes, depending on who you ask, is now in charge there in 538. They defeated Babylon in 539, and now they're in charge. And fortunately, they were a whole lot nicer than the Babylonians were, and under the Persians, Nehemiah and others were able to go back and rebuild the temple. And then 537, we get the vision of the future. So after a 3-week fast, Daniel has a vision of the future from his time until 168, whenever the Greeks are pretty much, for the most part, desecrating the Jewish temple and destroying Jewish life as it was known at that time. So we have a lot of different things that are happening during this time period. Any surprises or observations from that? No? We're going to cover all that in 8 weeks in exquisite detail. Maybe for some of you, painful detail. That just depends. Let's jump here. So what do you think the people of, knowing this timeline that we just went through, what were the people of Judah thinking? What do you think was going through their mind during this time of exile as they were walking that path from Judah to Babylon? What do you think they were thinking of their God during this time?
What they were thinking of God.
Yeah, of their God.
I would like to think that they would be, humbled, maybe, but I don't know that that's probably true with the
Yeah.
first set. I didn't realize, I don't think, that there were 3 different times that they took Jews to Babylon.
Yeah, it's not talked about a lot.
No, it isn't.
Yeah, there's.
I knew that, I think I knew that there were 2, but I didn't realize that there were 3. I knew that some of the poorest of the poor got left behind.
Right.
Which
Right.
almost makes you want to be one of the poorest of the poor.
Yeah, good point. Like, hey, let's not gonna stay here, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine what they would have been thinking about. They did know when they upset God, though. I think the Jews knew. They did come to a realization when they would upset God.
Right.
So,
I think that.
I've been wondering if God had forsaken them.
Right, did God
And in
abandon
truth,
them?
They had forsaken God.
Yeah. But they were probably thinking the other way.
Yeah.
You could think of it, did God abandon us, and now this other country is much more powerful, because that's how people would think then. This other much more powerful country, maybe we should turn to their gods. Maybe that's what they're thinking. And you can think through those questions as we go through this, because that's why this book was written, to help people remember, no, this Jewish God, the God of Judah, is more powerful than the Babylonian God, but it may not seem like it at this point. So, some things to think about. We're going to say something.
Should have been thinking, here we go again.
It could have been, yeah, yeah. Fun how everything repeats itself.
Probably instead of saying I deserve this, or they're saying why me.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, they actually would probably.
Right. Yeah. Why me? Yeah. Why did God abandon us again? Yeah, that's true. Some of the themes we're going to see throughout this is, I think one way you can look at Daniel is how one person can change the direction of a nation, how one person can change the viewpoint or the attitude, because it's very positive what he's able to do. You know, one thing to think about is that he came in as first of all, he was high up somewhere in Judah as part of the ruling class, was brought into Babylon, and was allowed to eventually, move his way up eventually into one of the most powerful positions there in Babylon. And he was able to, at the same time, he was manipulating Nebuchadnezzar and the other kings he worked for, while at the same time trying to keep the people of Judah from losing all sorts of hope. So he had a lot of different things going on. So he was a hero by very many people. For centuries later, he was a hero that they would continue to write about. And if you see books in the Apocrypha, as well as books outside of the Apocrypha, and of course outside of our canon, you see references to Daniel and what a hero he was, about what he was able to do and do that. And some people would say that Nebuchadnezzar was a historic person, but his name also became more of a symbol of evil and oppression. And then Daniel, of course, being a historic person, he became a symbol of heroism and being able to help save the people of Judah. So they became kind of their own legends when it came to that. And there'll be some references we talk about with that. Other things we'll see throughout some of the themes, is that God is sovereign over all countries, over all nations, over all people. And even though it seems like, you got to think that, the third deportation there probably not a lot of hope at that point, but there's this overall kind of current throughout this book, that even though it seems like God is not there, he is still a sovereign creator and ruler over all the world. So that's one of the big things we'll see. We'll see things related to hope, and the idea of a lot of what Daniel did, and a lot of what the author who put this together, or you probably say authors because, again, something we'll think about more is that the book is written in both Hebrew and Aramaic. So there's a lot of conversation about, there are multiple authors. It was written over a lengthy time period. Some would say it was written from the 6th century that we know from Daniel, what we saw in the timeline, to all the way up until the 2nd century, and finally put together probably closer to the 2nd century during the Maccabee revolt that happened. So we'll dig into that a little bit deeper, because there's a lot to how this is built out. We'll look at, and this kind of goes to God being sovereign, but we'll learn that the 4 beasts, if you guys remember from the Sunday school class, the 4 beasts are the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. we discussed during that time. We'll learn that God is sovereign even over those nations, and that they will eventually face His divine judgment. So we'll see that as a theme. We'll see a theme related to what happens to humans when they turn away from God, and this will be probably back to the beast vision that happens. The idea is that when people turn away from God, they become beasts themselves. They're no longer human. They're no longer considered to be, not human as in no longer humans as we know humans, but they're no longer who God intended them to be. No longer image of God is probably a better way to look at that. And then, of course, it's a book that is a promise for all generations. And and this goes all the way back to, like I said, in the 2nd century, about the 160s, whenever King Antiochus was taking out, doing all kinds of problems. Anyways, we'll cover that here later. Okay, who's excited about the literature type here? Anyone? Because that just really gets me going. No? It's a mixture. It's a mixture of literature. And the reason I bring this up, why do you think it matters? Why do you think it matters that this book that we've read, many of you I imagine have read multiple times, many of you know some of the more popular stories very well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You guys know that story well. You know Daniel in the Lion's Den very well. You probably, even knowing this class, you probably know about those, the visions that he has throughout this book, the 3 visions, very well. What is it? Why would it be significant that we know what the literary types of this book would be?
Because you teach narrative different than you teach poetry.
Okay.
Prose discourse, for one. So you gotta look at how it's built and kind of look at it that way.
To understand its context and its message.
Yeah, to see the message, to better understand the message, right? Because you have to think this wasn't written directly. They weren't thinking this class would be sitting here, over 2,000 years later, and we'd be talking about it. They were writing it to a group of people that would know what they were talking about. It'd be very see that. So if we were to look at, say, chapter 1 through 6, some people would call it a novella with pieces of poetry kind of peppered in throughout. Whenever we get into the 7 through 12, we're looking probably more at apocalyptic type literature, which includes a lot of vision literature. There's also some poetry tied into there as well. I mean, they just have to be based on, to be able to write a vision the way it was written, that would just be the style in which they would do that. And then the first 6 chapters is, like I said, it's more of a narrative. The book itself is broken up into 1 through 6 as kind of being the narrative of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then the other one is more based on visions in the future, the 7 through 12. So you have that breakdown as well. There's a lot of people who would compare it to not necessarily objective history. And this is where sometimes it gets a little cloudy or a little gray depending on where you're coming from with this. The argument would be, did Daniel happen, as in did Daniel really get tossed into a lion's den? Did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego really get tossed into a fiery furnace? So you'd have a group that say, absolutely, this is true history, it absolutely happened. You'd have another group that would say, no, this is purely just a story. This is just a story to make a point about that God does deliver people. You have the people in the middle who would say, yeah, it happened, but there's so much more to the story than it just actually happened. So it's not just objective history that's happening here. There's a lot more that the author is trying to communicate, and he pulls that into this and allows that to happen. If you were to look at, say, Judith and Tobit and the Apocrypha or the Book of Esther, it's similar sort of style and narrative when it comes to that sort of history, where it's based more on kind of trying to edify somebody's faith versus trying to make a historical point that something happened. It is great that it happened, but at the same time, are we building people's faith? Daniel's trying to build the faith of the people who were in this horrible situation, who were under these horrible oppressive regimes over this, time period that was just, to most people, were lifetimes of oppression. And so he's trying to bring that into it as well. So you can also think of this, especially in the first six chapters, as a guidebook for the people who are in exile, to understand who they were, to remember that they were people of God, and to be able to survive through that. So knowing that there's many different ways or many different viewpoints in this room, when I say that there's a group of people who would say it's just stories to help make a point, but maybe didn't necessarily have to happen, how does that kind of hit you in the gut?
It hits me as all wrong because you have to go back to what Christ said. He authenticated Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
So
he brings Daniel up.
Everything in this scripture is written by the authority of God. He is God. He authorized
Okay.
the legitimacy of Daniel.
Sure.
And everything is in it.
Okay, so through what Jesus said, that brings more authority to this, allowing it to be. Plus, it's inspired by God, or is that?
What we're saying here is fact.
It's fact.
It's fact.
Okay. I'm not disagreeing with you.
No,
I'm just curious. Are there other thoughts? If I were to say it's factually happened, but there's more to it, can we go with that? I mean, as in, we're trying to grow people's
Well,
faith
there has to
here.
be, because
Okay.
we never get the full story of anything from history, because it would be so drawn out and droning that you would lose interest after the first few pages of it anyway. I mean, how many things that went on, just last week that have already slipped away, that, or, you can take something a lot more significant, like World War II. How many stories of World War II do you ever hear of, or backstories?
Oh, right. Good point. Yep. Okay. Yes, sir.
I'd say it's real for one, just because it's improbable that a people would have been exiled, been taken captive, and then released 7 years later. So if there had to be things that happened to show signs to the people that were holding them captive that these people are their God is the God who he says he is.
Okay.
It's more likely that they would have been dispersed and never became a nation again.
Right. If it wasn't for this kind of.
Exactly.
Okay. So if you guys were in, I'm gonna go a little apologetics here. If you were at, I'll just use Starbucks because it seems like there's a lot of people who go to Starbucks. If you're at Starbucks and you're in a conversation with somebody and you said you're studying the book of Daniel right now, and the first thing that pops into this other person's mind or comes out of his, oh yeah, Daniel in the lion den, that's a neat story, but I don't think it happened. How would you respond to that? I mean, would you be like, no, you're an idiot? It did happen. Probably not. I hope not.
I think you have to build pretext
Okay.
to get to that. You just don't launch off into, well, it happened, and here's.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to go back and build a case about
Okay.
the sinful nature of man, and throughout the Old Testament,
Right.
that we saw over and over and over again.
Okay.
Kind of like what Cheryl was saying. It was the people would do bad and God would punish them, and then they would cry and pray, and then God would bail them. This occurred with the judges,
Right.
And then you build the case that he is a supreme God. He's omnipotent, and then you gradually move into. Why pick Daniel? What about the mighty things that Elijah did?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So.
No, yeah, my point was we're studying Daniel right now, and how would you, you're right, Elijah said some things too, you're like, is that even possible? But for Daniel being a popular story, Daniel's in the lion den, a popular story that if you went through VBS, if you happened to show up at Sunday school one day growing up, someone was probably talking about it because it's such a popular story. And it's more of, so you can say yes. I think you can say yes. It's a factual story. It happened. He upset the other rulers in which he was part of, or the group he was part of. He broke the law, and he was thrown into the lion's den, and God saved him and allowed him to come out.
But I think if you were at Starbucks discussing it with someone, you'd have to find out where they were with it.
Okay.
You know, do you
Well,
realize that?
You gotta
you know,
ask them why, and then
Right,
you might
exactly.
immediately get to go to, no, you're an idiot, right after you ask
Right.
them why.
Possibly,
Because
but-
No,
they, you know,
if
if they
you-
can't articulate.
I mean, if they know that God created the world already and He created the animals, is it a real far stretch to think that maybe He could tell one of those animals what to do? I'm just saying.
No, it's possible.
Yeah,
Yes,
so-
ma'am.
One of the things that I've learned is when I'm talking with someone, they tell me what they think,
Mhm.
that making an argument with them usually doesn't come to a conclusion.
No.
And one of my
Agreed.
best responses, and I've gotten good reaction to this, is I tell them it really doesn't matter what you think, it really doesn't matter what I think. What matters is what God thinks.
Okay.
And the reason I'm doing this is I'm on the quest to find out what God thinks.
Okay.
And usually that'll open the dialogue in a less confrontational
Yeah, then
manner than trying to contradict it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can see that.
You know,
And people love to explain themselves. I think if you
I
ask
think
them
so.
questions,
Mhm.
they're more than happy to tell you what they think usually.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
one of the problems I have with apologetics is you have to go back and set the stage. You know,
Mhm.
if it's the creation or whatever, you know, you go. So my question to you is, how would you answer that?
How would I answer it?
Yeah.
So I
mean,
wouldn't.
Some guy comes up there and he says, "That's a good story, but I don't believe it."
If we're, he asked, hey, what are you doing at the
And
church?
I have, that's my feeling in trying to explain, because I don't know, you know, you need to find out where they are, and
Right.
then you find yourself defending the development that was gonna be your defense for Daniel.
Yeah. I'm not, we won't tell Jeremy this, but I'm not a huge fan of apologetics. I mean, he is excellent at apologetics because he's been trained at it very well. And I think there's a level of doing that he is very good at. I wouldn't come from an apologetic viewpoint. I would come more from it'd be more of listening to their story about where they were coming from and why they think what they think. And then from there, I'd be able to provide my viewpoint of why I believe that Daniel is a powerful story, and beyond just the historical viewpoint of it, the idea of what this book was trying to accomplish during that time period. So while
That's a de facto apologetic.
okay, no, well, to a point it is, because you're also, I'm not, yeah, well, I mean, to a point.
Not an argumentative apologetic.
If you could say, I get it. So
More
you're
of an
saying it's still
academic one. It's
more of
very teaching
a
more
defense?
than-
Is it a defense of? I don't feel like you always have to. God can defend Himself, and He will work with and through people, and He'll work through us. But if we were to say that actually if you looked at this as a book of hope and a book of faith, and that's what they were trying to help the people of Judah know and see and understand while they were being oppressed, I think you get a whole lot further than trying to say, yeah, this is a factual time of someone getting thrown into a lion's den. He survived because God saved him. Because that's just one way to look at that.
What if you simply ask them, don't you think it's possible? That puts them into the situation of having to then tell you why they don't or do think it's possible.
Yeah, and I think it's
That's
It's not
actually-
an impossibility.
yeah.
It may not be the highest probability, but the fact that it's a probability far exceeds an impossibility.
Yeah. It's good. All right. So that was a very quick overview of what 1 and 6 is. 7 through 12 is when we start dealing with the heavenly divisions, chapters 7 through 12. The idea that these empires, the four empires mainly, the Persians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, and the Romans, are kind of running roughshod over the entire world, or the world that they know at this time. and how Daniel's visions helped them begin to understand, the people begin to understand that this isn't always going to happen. These powerful nations aren't always going to be oppressing them in this way. So there's a very apocalyptic viewpoints that he provides. A lot of Daniel is, there is eschatological apocrypha ties to it. I don't know if he was necessarily, or the author was necessarily focused on much of that as much as focused on, hey, this is what's going to happen over the next 500 years, as in the Apocrypha literature being more focused on the remote future of this nation. Now, depending on where you're coming from, some people would say, no, there is a lot of end time viewpoints here. And that's fine. I think that's okay to argue that. But I also don't want to lose sight of, he was trying to help a nation get out of where they were at that time and help them figure out that, this is going to last for a while, but eventually they're going to get out of it, and eventually God is going to be to get them out of them, help them doing that. So there's a lot of symbolic language tied to that he's going to be doing that. Some of there's 4 different points I kind of pulled out of this apocalyptic content that we see, is that God will bring an end to the suffering. He'll bring judgment over the wicked. The righteous will be rewarded. An age of peace and prosperity will be established. Where else have we heard or seen that sort of those 4 points?
When Jesus returns.
Right, that's Revelation, right? Yeah. There's the same sort of, it's basically the same sort of literature. Right. And so you get those 4 points in Daniel, as you also get in Revelation. And one of the discussions about how this was put together over time, like I said, there's historical documents that put